The story goes that he went to the window and pushed back the drapes, and the sun was blacked out by the Dust Bowl in Washington, D.C.
Hello, and welcome to District Dialogues, a conservation podcast, where we talk with ag producers, community members, and conservation partners about collaborative projects happening in Montezuma County, Colorado. I am Sensa Wolcott, the watershed coordinator for the Mancos Conservation District. Each episode will introduce you to conservation partners and how they are working collaboratively to conserve natural resources. This is the very first episode of District Dialogues. This will be a podcast focused on local natural resource issues and solutions created by the conservation districts of Montezuma County, Colorado, the Mancos Conservation District, and the High Desert Conservation District. Our goal is to highlight conservation efforts and opportunities in our community. Today, I will be chatting with Jack Burk about the history and importance of conservation districts. Jack has been a longtime resident in the Mancos Valley and has supported the Mancos Conservation District in a variety of ways over the years. Welcome, Jack, and thank you for taking time to join us on District Dialogues today. To start off, it'd be great for you to introduce yourself and give us an idea of your background and your involvement with conservation districts.
Well, thank you for having me. I guess my first engagement with conservation districts was in the 1960s. I got a job driving a tractor plowing for the Rio Grande Conservation District over in the San Luis Valley. And it was from 7 at night until 7 in the morning.
Ooh.
And that's what drove me to graduate school. So I spent the next 30 years teaching at the university and then came back to Mancos and got on the Mancos Conservation District Board in about 2002 or something like that. And I was served on the board for, 15, 16 years, something like that.
Did you hold different positions on the board?
Well, there were only two positions as far as I recall. There was the board member and the president.
Okay.
I was the president a lot. Also, there were 6 years in there when I was on the Colorado State Conservation Board.
Okay.
President part of the time.
Awesome. So you represented the conservation districts at the state level as well.
Yes.
That's great. It sounds like you've played a very integral role in the history of the Mancos Conservation District and conservation districts in general. With such a long history in the conservation district world, I'm sure you have a lot of knowledge about conservation districts. Can you give us an idea of what a conservation district is and maybe a little bit background about why they were created in the first place?
Well, I guess that's an illustration of how one person can make a really big difference. There was a guy named Hugh Hammond Bennett who got a degree in soils from the University of North Carolina back in the early part of the last century. And he got a job doing soil surveys for the USDA and became concerned about erosion in particular, both wind, water erosion, and so he started doing demonstrations and setting up demonstrations about soil erosion. And he was doing that for the public about the time the Dust Bowl started. And the Dust Bowl came on and it was filling the air with topsoil, which for a soil scientist, that was a critical kind of thing. And so he decided that some general organization needed to be had so that information could be gotten to the people who were plowing the shortgrass prairie in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And he was looking for some mechanism to get information out to them so that they could see that it was not just the drought, not just the wind, it was how they were, the farming practices that they were using that was causing the problem. And so he went to Washington, D.C. to meet with a congressional committee and convince them that there needed to be a national organization to take care of soil health. And he was in the midst of his presentation to them. And the story goes that he went to the window and pushed back the drapes, and the sun was blacked out by the Dust Bowl in Washington, D.C.
Ooh.
So if you think that the Dust Bowl wasn't widespread and important to everybody, it was. And the result of all that was the formation of the Soil Conservation Service as part of the Department of Agriculture. And the Soil Conservation Service, that was in in the mid 30s almost, probably.
Okay.
About 1935, something like that. And so it became a nationwide organization that President Roosevelt wrote letters to all of the states asking if they would come up with a mechanism for communication between landowners and the Soil Conservation Service so that there would be a way of interacting with the people that were actually out working the land. And that interaction turned out in the long run to be soil conservation districts.
Okay.
And soil conservation districts became a nationwide thing. People in the communities where they were had to vote them in. There had to be a majority of a board of supervisors that wanted to become a soil conservation district. And it became basically universal to have those, and they are across the country. And that is the mechanism that has been used ever since to allow communication between farmers and ranchers and landowners of all sorts to get information and monetary support and those kinds of things from the Soil Conservation District to take care of management problems on land. So that's how conservation districts came into being.
That's awesome. It's super interesting to see that it was kind of in response to one certain natural resource concern. We were really thinking about erosion, and that one little problem kind of sparked this whole issue and this whole movement to create these districts. So they were created as a result of that need. Have they changed since their inception in the 1930s, or are they still specifically focused on soil conservation?
Well, there's a lot about soil conservation that the conservation districts do, but in about 1994 or something like that, the Soil Conservation Service became the Natural Resources Conservation Service.
Mm-hmm.
And so they expanded from just being focused on soil to any natural resource conservation that was important to the functioning of land management. And that's the time that the soil conservation districts became conservation districts instead of soil conservation districts. At the time, there was a tremendous pushback because many people felt like soil was the key to the whole thing. And the truth is, it probably all does go back to the soil at some point along the way.
Right.
But there are lots of things that the NRCS and conservation districts do that is not directly involved with soils. And so it's probably a more appropriate title than it would have been as a soil conservation district.
Yeah, it is interesting to see how everything kind of ties back to soil.
Well, if you look at what Mancos is doing, they're involved in the watershed project. They're involved in water quality and quantity. They're involved in forest management. They're involved in education. They're involved in all kinds of things that are in addition to soil health, which is a big involvement that they have. So
right. Yeah, it's interesting to see that it kind of started with soil, but they've really evolved into these unique kind of entities that are really that link between landowners and these agencies that can help provide resources and things. And so each one is kind of tailored to meet the needs of each community. And so in Mancos, you said we have water and forestry and soil health and these different pieces to help meet our specific needs in our community. Can you tell us a little bit about how conservation districts are structured in Colorado?
In about 1938, a couple of years after the Soil Conservation Service was initiated, the state of Colorado passed the Colorado Soil Conservation Act. And conservation districts or soil conservation districts at that time were part of that Title 37 Act that set up all of the conservation responsibilities that the state was willing to take on. And what they did is they set the conservation districts up as special districts under the supervision of the Colorado Department of Agriculture. And so the conservation districts are all supervised and aided by the Colorado Department of Agriculture Conservation Division. And that's where the Colorado State Conservation Board is located. And they're the ones that have oversight of the conservation districts, and they're responsible for passing out whatever funds the legislature puts toward natural resource conservation in Colorado. They move that money out to the conservation districts.
Awesome. So conservation districts in Colorado are part of the Colorado Department of Agriculture, and they're overseen by Colorado State Conservation Board.
Right.
Awesome. And then each district is overseen by a board of directors. Is that right? How does that work?
There's, I think they call them board of supervisors, probably. Those are elected local people. It's a volunteer job. The number of people that are involved is usually 3 to 5, sometimes a few more in each conservation district, but they are elected for 4-year terms to serve on that board. And their job is multifaceted. At a minimum, they are interactive with the NRCS to move federal money that's been allocated to cost share programs for installing irrigation systems and doing plantings and land management things that require a certain amount of expertise. NRCS provides the engineers, and they have experts in grazing and range management and all of those kinds of things that support and keep the conservation movement up to date with regard to the most recent findings in those areas. And there's a considerable amount of money comes from the Farm Bill on a regular basis, and that's how it gets distributed to the landowners that are out raising crops and animals and all of those kinds of things, is by the interaction between the conservation districts and NRCS. Conservation districts also have conservation technicians who work directly in the communities where the conservation district is located, and they're the ones that go out on the land and help the landowners figure out what's needed and all of those kinds of things. And then they interact with NRCS to get together the formal plans for whatever engineering is necessary for water installations or things like that.
Awesome. Seems like there's a lot of important roles that conservation district and the board plays in helping producers in local communities. Are there specific challenges that you see conservation districts in Colorado facing?
Well, having served 6 years on this Colorado State Conservation Board, I'm well aware of the difference between successful conservation districts and those that are not so successful. And those that are not so successful are really just doing what I just described with regard to moving money from the federal government to landowners. And that's about all they do. The big challenge seems to be to get over the hump of being creative and doing new things, reaching out beyond that. For example, watershed projects and water quality and the things like forestry things that Mancos is doing and all of that are an important thing that a lot of conservation districts haven't figured out how to do yet. And so if you go to state meetings or national meetings, you'll find that there's a fairly dramatic difference in the performance level of different conservation districts depending upon their leadership and whether or not they have reached out beyond and are really working on other natural resource concerns in their community.
Yeah. So it sounds like one of the important challenges is really being able to listen to landowners and think of innovative, different ways to kind of help fill those niches and address those needs.
There's a regular process that happens every year from the conservation districts, and that is to invite local landowners to a meeting to bring in their questions about things that they need more information about, or tell them how to do various things, how to get the money that's available, tell them what kind of money's available and all of that. There's 2 organizations that are also important to the process of communicating with the people that are providing the grant monies for land management, and that's the Colorado Association of Conservation Districts and the National Association for Conservation Districts. Colorado Association of Conservation Districts represents all of the 74, I believe, conservation districts in the state, and they are involved in various educational programs and things like that. But probably as important as anything is their lobbying in Denver to get things that the people that are out on the land are needing to have happen, and they work in that direction. And basically the national organization does the same thing, only in Washington, D.C. So they have a significant impact on the Farm Bill every time it comes up for renewal, and they pass along the description of problems and struggles that people that are out on the land are having that might be able to be solved by allocation of resources to do that.
That's great. It's awesome to see that there's really this local entity that can help through these different channels with the Colorado Association of Conservation Districts and the National Association of Conservation Districts really channel and make that difference kind of all the way up the chain.
Well, I think that the really neat part about it is that each conservation district can design programs and emphasize things that are really important in their own community, so that you don't have some national organization or even some state level organization that's trying a one-size-fits-all sort of approach to passing out money or to solving problems that might not even be in your community. So it's a very significant advantage to be able to, for the Conservation District Board or supervisors to sit down and say, this is what's important to our community, and pass that along to whoever needs to know about it.
Yeah, that really is a very unique role that they play. Are there any other benefits that you see that are served by conservation districts to the community? Anything specific?
Well, yes, a lot of them. I guess I would say that education is probably a key thing that conservation districts are involved in. The Mancos Conservation District was responsible for starting up the Montezuma School to Farm project and managed that for several years until it got independent and went off on its own. And so the schools of Montezuma County are impacted greatly by what the Conservation District did at that point, because they have gardening classes and science classes and things that are engaging students in things that are not available in a regular school curriculum. Mm-hmm. The educational benefits that conservation districts offer to adult residents of the community. They have soil health workshops. They have workshops for realtors so they can explain water law to them. They have water law workshops, all of those kinds of things. And it's a significant advantage for the community to have an active conservation district that is passing out information that's important to the community.
Yeah, I think the education aspect is a really important part that conservation districts play. And it's something that, especially in our community, we hear a lot when we ask, what does the community need? What can we provide? And education is one of those things that always pops up into the forefront of people's minds.
Well, there's a hunger for it, I think. Even after School to Farm moved off on their own, why the Conservation District has been able to continue with classes on Fridays at the library and other things that are well attended and important ways that kids get information that are natural resource oriented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's awesome. Is there anything else that you wanted to bring up regarding conservation districts and kind of the history of them that we didn't cover so far?
Well, I think we pretty well covered the history. I think that if you look at the history of the Mancos Conservation District in particular, I think it has changed dramatically since the turn of the century. I think that the advent of the watershed program and the School to Farm project and the Salinity project which I haven't mentioned, were all three very important to moving the Mancos Conservation District to where it is today. The salinity project, for what people don't know about that, we called it the Mancos Valley Water Conservation Project when we were initiating it back in 2006, because it was really, that's what was important to the Mancos Valley, was the water conservation. The salinity was the source of the money that we got to pay for multi-million-dollar pipelines that went in.
Right.
But the removal of the salinity from the river was for the benefit of the people down the river and not so much for the people in the valley. So we were able to do both of those things by piping the water. We conserved tremendous amounts of water. In fact, on our ranch, we probably increased our water availability by about 50% by taking the water that we had rights to and actually getting it to the ranch.
Right.
Instead of losing it out the bottom of the ditch.
Right. It can be so tricky.
And so there was a lot of benefits there. There were a few negatives. A lot of those ditches that had been there since the 1880s and 1890s were really almost like streams. And when those dried up because the water went into pipes, why, that was a little bit of a difficult thing for many people in the community. The Conservation District supervisors decided that everything has positives and negatives, and the positives far outweighed the negatives in that situation.
Yep.
So I think it depended on whether you had a nice riparian ditch bank in your backyard, whether you
Right.
reacted that way to it or not.
Right.
Those are things that the Mancos Conservation District has done.
Yeah, it's great to see how it's kind of evolved and changed over the years, kind of to continue being tailored to those different things that the community has expressed a need for. Starting out as a soil conservation district focused on soil and erosion and things, they've been able to grow and change into these entities that are really kind of multifaceted and doing a lot of different things to help support the community.
I think that's one of the things that makes a successful conservation district, is being able to change as things in the environment change, and as expertise is developed, and as science comes up with new ways of doing things. Somebody needs to keep on top of that and make that information available. And I think the Mancos Conservation District has been very effective at that.
Well, thanks. I think you've provided a lot of really great insight and history. I feel like every time I sit down and chat with you, I always learn more about the Conservation District, even after all the times we've talked. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Is there anything that you're working on that you'd like to share before we go today?
Well, we have a project going on our ranch. We've partnered with two neighboring landowners and with the Montezuma Land Conservancy and Trees, Water, and People and Mountain Studies Institute to restore something over a mile of the Mancos River riparian area down along Road 39. And we are in the midst of that. We've been installing PALS, post-assisted log structures, that are our wimpy way of trying to mimic a beaver and their ability to build dams, so that we slow down the flow of the river and help saturate the margins of the river so that riparian trees and vegetation can get reestablished. And also it makes pools in the river and helps with fish survival, helps keep the water cool, and all those kinds of things. So our goal is to try to bring back the riparian area in that area, and it's happening in other places along the river as well, but to bring it back with a full gallery forest and make it like it was 100 years ago, or like 150, I guess.
Yeah, that's awesome. Quite an undertaking to put those structures in, isn't it?
Well, not for me, but for the people who do it, it is. Yes. No, it's a really great crew. The Trees, Water, and People and the Native American Conservation Corps has been doing an awful lot of that. And Mountain Studies has provided the hydrologist to decide where the structures are going and all of that to get maximum advantage of what we're doing with them.
Awesome. How long do you have all the structures in place now, or are you still working on it? How long will it take?
No, the first structures were installed last fall.
Okay.
And we kind of ran out of season. And so there are a few more to be installed this coming year.
Great.
After the runoff off season, I suppose, is when all that will happen. It's a long-term thing. The traditional harvest program for Native Americans, particularly for the Mountain Ute people, is also part of that. And that's one of the reasons why Trees, Water, and People are interested in putting it in. So the plants that we're planting are lots of native things that you find in the riparian corridors of this area, but they're also focused a lot on things that the Native Americans can use for their foods and crafts and medicinal plants and things like that. So ultimately, they will, with permission, come onto the land and do harvests of particular things at particular times that are important to them.
That's awesome. It seems like a really awesome project to implement on your property and get to work with a lot of interesting variety of partners as well.
It's the only thing that makes it possible is partnerships like that, because it's expensive and it's a lot of labor involved and there's a lot of expertise that's needed to do it correctly. And so it's that partnering that makes it work.
Yep, for sure. Well, thank you so much for sharing and being here today. I've been your host, Sensa Wolcott, and our guest today was Jack Burk. Stay tuned for part 2 of this episode in February, where we will hear about more specific programs offered by our Montezuma County Conservation Districts. Thanks for tuning in to District Dialogues. You can find a transcript of this episode, along with links to any programs or resources we mentioned, on our website, mancoscd.org. Don't forget to subscribe to hear the latest from your Montezuma County Conservation Districts.